looking at the SDGs through a racial equity lens. So we're going to talk about our meeting agreements, and then Ben from Echoing Green is going to do an initial poll. I'm Emily Weltman, by the way, member of Catalyst 2030. And I have some of my colleagues here as well. And one of Ben's colleagues from Echoing Green, Tiffany, is here. After Ben does the poll and kind of reviews the results, we're going to just do a quick overview on the structural racism and how it relates to the SDGs, how they were created, and where the big gaps are. Then we're going to have a panel conversation and then do some breakout groups and really kind of interrogate the SDGs from an intersectional lens. So here's our meeting code of conduct. So this is just the things we want you to keep in mind. Also, please go in the 3 dots next to your name, next to your chat. Feel free to put in your name. You can put your country if you want, your location, and your pronouns. Be conscious and respectful, so call people what they choose to be called. Speak your truth and respect each other's experiences. Approach differences with an attitude of curiosity and understanding. If you are like me and you speak often, try to step back and listen. If you are an observer, feel free to, speak up, and you're welcome to speak. Privacy is your right. You don't need to have your camera on. You don't need to share. We would love it. We encourage it. We want to hear from everyone, but it's completely up to you and your comfort level. So I'm going to stop my sharing for a moment so you can do the, Ben can do the poll.
Yeah, great. Hi, everyone. Ben from Echoing Green here. Very, very glad to be a part of this. I'm going to just start us off with a brief introductory poll, and just to frame, we're going to spend most of our time talking about the SDGs and how social innovation and social entrepreneur communities use them or don't use them, strengths and challenges, et cetera. We're gonna dive into that. But I want to start us off with a quick kind of setting the scene and just general kind of poll questions as we think about how we want to take this topic of structural racism and make it a bigger conversation through Catalyst 2030. So some of these questions are specific to our organizations and our work. But yeah, and not particularly the SDGs, but really excited to hear about from folks and get folks thinking about this topic. So I'm going to launch this poll here, and let me start it. All right. So can everyone see the questions here? If folks could take a minute and kind of go through these. The questions at a high level, I'll read them through while you're thinking of them. We're interested in understanding your organizations, the way in which you engage, the things which you need to support, and generally your current status in implementing racial equity initiatives. So we're wondering, how highly do you believe in your assessment, your organization or program prioritizes racial equity efforts? What the biggest challenges or concerns with implementing racial equity work are, whether you have current racial equity initiatives ongoing, whether you manage and track racial equity as part of your program or investment priorities. Something I have as a data and research focused person, is something I'm particularly interested in, as well as what activities would be most beneficial for you and your organizations to pursue racial equity efforts. So as we try to build these spaces that focus on racial equity, that focus on having these conversations, knowing this level of information will really help us set an understanding of where everyone is at, because we want to make sure when we design content that we're designing it to what people actually need. So we really appreciate your input on these questions. I'll give folks a couple more. I see most people have filled in and responded. I'll give folks another minute or so to just sit and reflect and think on these questions, and then in a minute or so I'll show the results and we can talk about them. If you have any questions, please feel free to just drop them in the chat. Happy to answer. So I'll let this go for 1 more minute, and then we can have a brief conversation about the results. Okay, haven't seen any more responses, so I think I'm going to call it here. If folks want to, I'll give you a 30-second warning. I'm gonna close it in 30 seconds. If you have any things entered in there, please just go ahead and submit them now. I'd really appreciate it. And okay, thanks everyone. I'm going to end the poll and let's take a look. Can everyone see the results now? Okay, great. So yeah, on this first question of whether or how highly our organizations prioritize racial equity efforts, see, there's a bit of a split. I'm glad to see that folks, a lot of folks are coming in here with kind of pre-existing high priorities. But the fact that there are folks who are interested in investing in it or who have some work to do, that's why we're here. We're here to level set, to understand where folks are at, and to figure out how we can mutually support ourselves in moving forward. We have in seeing the challenges, the biggest challenge appears to be this lack of information on approaches, best practices, and tools. That is, I think, really exciting to me personally. I'd love to welcome other colleagues and co-hosts, and they're not excited, but it's given that is what we're hoping to do through this racial equity. It's like, okay, thank you for validating the need for it. We're really I'm glad to see that is that folks are kind of in agreement with us that it's really needing to come together on strategies and tools to implement these, and hopefully we can address some of those today. There is, of course, also the lack of understanding and comfort on the issue, which is one of the reasons we opened this session with the agreements. We're trying to create a safe and welcoming environment, difficult conversations to have. So we ask everyone to kind of go in with that mind of curiosity and understanding that there's a lot tied up in this, and we really need to kind of collectively work through it.
And
again,
Ben, just to keep us on time, we got to wrap up in like a minute or two.
Yep. Yeah. Just gonna wrap up in like 2 minutes here.
Okay.
So again, split on racial equity initiatives have started. Hopefully we can move this number to 100% by the time that we've moved forward. Again, and not surprised entirely on the split on racial equity. And again, another piece of good validation here on open forums to discuss racial equity topics. It's what we're hoping to create here. So again, thanks everyone for spending your time thinking about this, for giving us this information. It's really helpful and we appreciate it. So with that, without any further ado, I'm going to pass it back to Emily, and we can get started on our conversation with SDGs and structural racism. Thanks everyone.
Thank you. Yes. So thank you for that, Ben, and we'll be sharing those and using them again when we meet again. So they're not that we had to race through. We will definitely make sure that people are aware of what was said and how that informs going forward. I concur that it is nice to see that people just want tools and they want resources. The team of people that I brought in today and the people that I work with and people that Echo and Green work with are very versed in this. So Ben and I always say, like, this is not necessarily, we're leading and facilitating the session, but we're not necessarily, not that there's an expert on anti-racism, but we're here to share information, and we're also always learning. So there isn't a final definitive answer on how to do this right. But the point is to do something. Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen again. And we're just going to go a quick overview. If I go at too fast, and this should work now. You can see, we're good. Thumbs up, someone, anyone? Yeah. Okay, great. So we're going to talk about the SDGs from a systemic a lens with racial equity. And basically, just what we have to say about it is not great. They were not created with that in mind. So just getting that right out there and being really honest about it, we want to talk about how they were created and what they actually do say about global issues of colonization and race and ethnicity and how that impacts people around the world. So when the SDGs were created, they were created based on the Millennial Development Goals, which were not working. So the MDGs weren't working, so they made the SDGs. They were created in 2012 before a lot of the dialogue was happening as it is now. And then if you look even further back, when you look at the pictures of the UN founding, it's very clear in the black and white photos. And actually there's an article where it says, like, just look at the black and white photo of the UN, that, you know, when it was founded, and you'll know what the history is around the UN and why there are challenges. So it's, you know, it was mostly white men. Well, it was all men for sure, and mostly white. There was a picture that I saw of the human rights launch of the human rights campaign that the UN did when they made the Declaration for Human Rights. And it's a picture of a bunch of kids around a newspaper with, it says, you know, declaring the human rights, and they're all white children except for two children that look like, I don't know, but they look like maybe they're from India or Asia. There are no other people of color in it at all. There's definitely no Black children in it. So just thinking about how this was all founded with this idea of like whose rights matter is really important, because that is kind of still showing up today, right? But it's really important that we address it, because you know, systemic racism causes all of the problems of violence and poverty. It increases it, and it's making it worse. And so if we don't, as social entrepreneurs, tackle this, we will, and tackle decolonization and anti-racism through our own work, even if the SDGs fall short, we won't be able to tackle the global problems that we're all here to tackle. So if we're looking at that from a brass tacks of data, the green sliver represents the amount of times that the SDGs actually, you know, require, quote unquote, disaggregation of data over race and ethnicity. So it's very minimal. And if you look at that from a perspective of the language, now we all in our group talk about language isn't the end all be all, but it's an indicator of investment, and it's an indicator of a knowledge to these issues. And so, for example, if I'm, you know, looking back at this other slide, we've got the targets and the indicators. You know, the indicators are the ones with the extra number at the end. That's where you're supposed to really be working towards. Well, first of all, when the SDGs were created, there were no indicators. There weren't even targets. There were just the goals. There were 17 goals. And then they've added layers on them. The indicators are where you're getting closer to actually doing metrics and measuring, but you're not actually getting to even really dialed in as much as you need to. And there's only 2 indicators or 5 indicators out of 213 that say anything about race and ethnicity. Reducing inequality should be our one, as the one that we would hope would talk more about race and ethnicity and colonization, but it does not. So, all right, I'm going to hand this over to Cindy now.
Thank you, Emily. Once again, hi everyone. Good morning and evening. My name is Sin Yi. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. So going forward, jumping off of what Emily is talking about with the SDG, really what is missing is really the intersectional lens talking about anti-racism and decolonization. So it's important for us, when we want to combat all the systems of oppression, to be able to name them in our goals, and basically what is not measured doesn't get improved on, right? And we all know that. And so, as Emily has mentioned as well, the SDGs, they do not include any single indicator requiring any disaggregation by race or ethnicity, even when they talk about reducing inequalities. And even when they talk about gender inequality, it's between men and women. And we all know that gender identity does not just include men and women. It's a spectrum. There is folks who are non-binary, genderqueer, and they're not included in that. So the focus is really on the fact that the SDG does not take into consideration the real life intersectional processes that are influenced by systemic racism, the history of colonization of many countries, and a system of oppression that are existing in many different countries as well. So for example, Sweden is at the top of this list to be very sustainable, but it actually consumes the highest amount of natural resources. On average, Sweden consumes as a country 32 metric tons, and that's 5 times over the boundary, and an average is 7 to 12 tons. Looking at Finland, which is number 3 on this SDG list, the carbon footprint is 13 metric tons and is considered one of the most polluting countries per capita. So as you can see that they're not, the outcome in terms of their measurement with these SDG goals is not aligning with their purpose. And this is putting aside, notwithstanding the nonprofit industrial complex and the funding by philanthropists, which plays again in that white supremacy system. So that's part of the risk, right? That there's a lack of investment because we, again, don't name it. It's all intertwined. That if we don't name white supremacy and racism, it threatens the reach of the whole point of SDG. And with capitalism, where it exploits people at the lowest cost possible, it continues this system of theft and exploitation, and it maintains a concentration of wealth and philanthropy, which we talked about with the industrial complex, where it's up to the top 1% of wealthy people to fund any nonprofit or any social causes. And it shouldn't be that way, right? It shouldn't be the 1% deciding what's more important than the other. And this is what happens when the wealthy fund the processes that they don't have an intersectional lens, they don't have folks or talents in those systems to dismantle the oppression that's happening and address it in a holistic way. And that's what we mentioned in the last point, where it fails to center those in the greatest danger. And we can talk about it in the next slide, where we specifically focus on Indigenous folks. As we know, especially in the United States and currently in India. But let's go back to the United States in the context of the US, where Black folks and people of color are disproportionately impacted by COVID, and yet they are also the lowest population in terms of being able to get vaccinated, taking into consideration both the medical inequities historically and also the fact that the vaccine location and sites are not where the Black population is. And also, we also want to highlight before I pass it on that police brutality and anti-Blackness is a global epidemic. Let's look at Myanmar and Colombia, right? And with Indigenous folks, I think this is the most stark comparison, that 80% of the world's biodiversity is protected by Indigenous folks, who now make up only 5% of the world's population. So if we want to talk about sustainable development, why don't we leave it to the people who know how to do it best? And yet they're also the most eradicated, most neglected. And taking into consideration that yesterday too was also a day where we commemorate and raise awareness towards the murdered and missing Indigenous women, who are 10 times more likely to be murdered than the average murder rate in the States. That all these are not taken into consideration by SDG. So now we'll pass it on for talking about the conversation.
Thank you. That was perfect. Couldn't have said it better myself. So I think, it's really clear that from what Cindy said, that, the misses that are happening, I think that, to reiterate, the challenge with the way the philanthropy works now is still impacting all of us in this room, and it's still really informing how we get to work and whose voices are heard, and that really is influencing also who created the SDGs. So the SDGs were created from the, a huge funder was the Gates Foundation, right? So that is still a biased point of view, even just thinking about who's funding them, right? And so in these rooms and in spaces where we say we need to center the people that are impacted most, and the climate change obviously impacts poor people the most, and it impacts people of color the most. We're not centering them in the problem. They're not in the rooms right now. They're not here to have those conversations. So even in this room, the majority of us have access to things and a way to get into this room that a lot of people do not, but that is not how these problems are going to get solved. So we're going to have a breakout rooms now. We're going to have a conversation and kind of interrogate the SDGs from a point of decolonization and systemic racism, and look at what they're missing and vice versa. So how that before we do that, we're gonna do the panel first. Sorry, see, I'm reading it and I'm not even getting it right. Okay, we're gonna do the panel first. Sorry. So we're gonna, before we interrogate that from an activity and breakout room perspective, we're going to do it in a group. So Ben and Jennifer and Sydney and Tiffany are gonna speak on how the SDGs and systemic racism and decolonization impact their work. So I'm gonna turn it over to Ben, are you going first?
Yeah, I'm happy to start us off. Thanks for all of that framing. Really appreciated it. So I am, just to reintroduce, I'm Ben Beers. I'm a Deputy Director of Research at Echoing Green. And to address, so my pronouns are he, him. I'm currently in Queens, in Astoria, Queens. And so we're going to start. I'm going to answer the first two questions, and then I'm also joined by my colleague at Echoing Green, Tiffany Thompson, who's the Senior Director for Global Partnerships and Equity, and I'm going to pass it to her to talk a little bit about what Echoing Green is doing internally. I'm going to share one thing before I jump in here really quick. You can read about what I'm going to talk about at the link I just posted there. Sorry, the link is a little messy. But there's two questions I'm going to address, which is, what is your experience and context working with the UN, the SDGs, and other global initiatives? And how did the SDGs contribute to your anti-racism or DEI work? If they don't, why not? And I'm going to really address this from the perspective of Echoing Green Fellows. In 2019, right before the pandemic began, Echoing Green had a conference in Los Angeles, where one of the key topics that we raised to our fellow community was the issue of the Sustainable Development Goals and how our fellows were able to use that. To be clear, one piece of context: Echoing Green is an organization, if you're unaware, that provides seed fund or grant funding, seed funding, however you want to describe it, to social innovators who are doing who are doing work to solve a social problem. We are currently right now for the next 3 to 5 years, although ideally longer term than that, as a kind of principle, focusing on racial equity directly in our giving exclusively. So I think these are, it's a good time that we're having this conversation because they're very interlinked. So back to the conference. In 2019, we gathered our fellows to talk particularly about the SDGs. And at a very high level, when we initiated this conversation, the consensus was that we're dealing with existential problems. Like, as Emily raised, climate change is an existential problem. Economic concentration of wealth and economic oppression, racial, social, economic justice, all of these issues are existential. They are life and death questions, which necessitate collective action. But if that collective action isn't collaboratively designed with frontline and impacted leadership front and center in the decision-making at the highest levels of political and economic policy, then those policies aren't going to be able to fully address the scope of these problems that we are trying to solve collectively. So while the SDGs are, an attempt at creating this level of collective action, that, as Emily mentioned, and the framing has showed that the framework of who is making those decisions and how they were decided upon has been a really large structural challenge to actually implementing the SDGs to the fullest extent. So in the conversation, we had these conversations with fellows where we particularly dug into, it was 3 SDGs. I'm off the top of my mind, I'm struggling to remember exactly which ones they were, I apologize. But we talked about, maybe one of my colleagues can chime in the chat if they remember. It's blanking on it for a second, but really what we identified were that the actors who are implementing the Sustainable Development Goals, to the context of how we use them, our fellows use them often in their work. But to use them more fully, the actors who implement them need to have a shared understanding of systemic inequalities and their causes. Like, without a understanding of how systemic racism impacts how policy decisions are made and how those policy decisions have consequences in the communities that they are intended to kind of support, then they're not actually going to help meet those goals. We're never going to meet the Sustainable Development Goals if we don't actually tailor and listen to folks who are most directly impacted by them in order to solve them. The second point here,
Just so we know.
sorry, I need one more minute.
Yeah, no, that's so fine. I just wanted to let you know we're
Okay,
done.
great. Thank you. So that is, oh, thanks, Liza. My colleague Liza is also here. We focused on decent work, reduced inequalities, and climate action. The second point that we really focused on, and this is one of the, like, how does the SDGs contribute to our work, is that it's really filled us with a clear understanding that implementing the SDGs requires grassroots democratic methods, right? Like, we need to go from the ground up when we are designing these solutions and when we are re-implementing them. That is what we need to have effective systems level changes. The final one that we, and this is, I think, key to these 2 points are very key to how we would like to work with the SDGs, is that we need to have radical power sharing, which means that there actually has to be ceding of control in terms of who makes these political and economic decisions, as well as large scale economic redistribution of resources. So, you know, when there is a financial gap, the data says that a financial gap between achieving the SDG, where we are currently at, in achieving the SDGs was between 2.5 and $3 trillion a year. Like, that is a lot of money that we are not seeing move and not being redistributed in the ways that we need it to. So those are high level conclusions that we had in terms of what our experience with the SDGs, and that all leads to this conclusion that frankly, we don't see the SDGs currently as being the primary mechanism by which we at Echoing Green implement anti-racism work. To talk a little bit more about how we are approaching these issues kind of internally, and to talk about some of our initiatives on addressing anti-racist and structural racism, I'm going to pass it over to Tiffany, who can dive into those.
Thank you so much, Ben. I really do appreciate that. And thanks for having me, everyone. As Ben said, my name is Tiffany Thompson. I am the Senior Director of Global Partnerships and Equity at Echoing Green. But before even talking more about the role that I'm in now, it's important to discuss the history of how I've seen this organization shift over just over the last couple of months, but even over the last couple of years. My particular journey with Echoing Green dates back to 2015, when I was managing at the time, our Black Male Achievement Fellowship Program, which was the only fellowship at the organization that explicitly focused on race. And the fellowship was the first of its kind that worked to identify and support emerging social entrepreneurs that were working to improve the life outcomes of Black men and boys in the United States. The fellowship, which was launched in 2012, was a partnership with the Campaign for Black Male Achievement and with the support of Open Society Foundation. We supported 8 classes of fellows, including more than 85 working across the nation. As you all might know, in June of 2020, we then launched our Racial Equity Philanthropic Fund, which was really designed as more than just a fundraising vehicle, but it really was a turning point for the organization, moving from a broad systems change focus to really a targeted focus, really significant around the evolution of the organization. Key to that is really supporting the racial equity framework of both our policies, procedures, and structure. And in order to meet those goals, we really had to apply a results accountability model to that. We really had to normalize conversations around race, increase our development of staff and board capacity through trainings and operationalizing racial equity by embedding those lenses into our decision-making processes. But really, to understand the importance of that internal work at Echoing Green, we have to really reflect on the demographics of the folks that we are serving internally. However, unlike most nonprofits and folks in the social innovation space, Echoing Green was doing kind of well in terms of its demographic internally. We had, at the time, prior to launching this work, we had a 50-50 split of internal staff being people of color and white folks. But our board, like most nonprofits, is 71% white. Also, it's important to know that before hiring our consultant to launch this racial equity transformational work, we launched a staff survey. And submissions proved that 53% of staff indicated that they have a basic understanding of concepts related to race. But despite that understanding, 53% of staff indicating having somewhat of fear saying the wrong thing when they're talking about race at work. So we launched on this journey to center race in our work by launching a search for a consultant to walk with us on this journey. And we're proud to say, as of February, we begun our work with our consultants, Be Free. If you remember the stats that I said earlier with our internal folks being 50% people of color and 50% white folks, as of this month, our current staff demographic is now 61% people of color compared to our 50% in October. We've embarked on this journey with Be Free to really unlearn, to upskill our staff, because quite frankly, when our staff that joined prior to our Racial Equity Philanthropic Fund and our explicit focus on race internally, they joined an organization that was not focused on race. It did not require you to have a race analysis. It did not require you to understand that race is a key determinant in all of the social issues that we are working towards and funding for. So this work with our consultants at Be Free is really about assessing everything, individual fluency, self-awareness, providing an opportunity for us to train our staff, to hire more explicitly around race, to be more diverse in our recruitment. It is allowing our staff to be comfortable being uncomfortable. It is really allowing people to grow. And quite frankly, it is allowing us to be more explicit around how we find the right partners. What is it that we look for in the partners that we work with? What are the guiding principles that we need in terms of anti-racism, and how do we ensure that all of the work that we're doing internally reflects our work externally? We cannot require that we focus on racial equity externally without ensuring and upskilling the staff that we have at Echoing Green. So I'll stop there. And I see my colleague in the chat has indicated who our consultant firm is. It is Be Free. And we have begun this journey with them. And we are now at the point where we are doing listening and learning sessions with our staff. We are hearing directly from them. We are hearing what do they need? How do they assess and interact with race in their everyday being? How does that impact their work? And what do they need in order to do their work effectively? The next step of that will be completely overhauling our policies and procedures. It will be using the data that we get from our listening and learning sessions to implement staff trainings. And then we're going to do those same things with our board, requiring that they get upskilled in the importance of how to analyze and assess race as a key determinant in all the social issues. And then beginning to outline how we do that more explicitly in our hiring practices. So I'll stop there as we move on, and I'll answer a few more questions after the rest of the folks speak.
Jennifer, you want to go first? All right, I'll go first then. Thank you. So that was a great insight for me. You know, I'm not here to advertise any business even if I have any, and I don't have a pressure of doing that as well. So I'm here as a diversity, equity, and inclusion scholar with my school, and I have also have experience working with nonprofit and higher education, working on their inclusivity and also recruitment of folks with diverse backgrounds through analytics. And so I'm here to provide insight really into the future of the workforce, which are people my age and younger, millennials, Gen Zs. And we are not to be ignored. We're the largest proportion of activists, whether it means to be in the system, to beat the system, or through externally making changes to the actual system itself. The consensus between any of us is that it's past time for us to tackle systemic issues by dismantling it. One of the biggest one, like mentioned in the slides previously, is white supremacy, that white men have been taking up a huge part of the time, whether it's speaking during presentations or in leadership positions. As we know in Forbes 500, a huge proportion of the leaderships are white folks, and especially white men. And also, we have to remember that this is a global affair. It's not just in the US context that racism exists. I am from Singapore, from Southeast Asia. I've traveled to at least 5 to 10 different countries and lived in some for a couple months. And I can say that anti-Blackness is a global epidemic, and same with police brutality. And so I think it's important for, excuse me, answering the question of how is anti-racism part of my practice, process, and design. I would say it's part of our lives, you know, and as a person of color, it's not something that I can ignore. And I guess it's great that some of us here are able to not think about it, but some of us, we leave it. It's like what Ben has mentioned, that it's a life and death issue for many of us. What do we do to create equity and belonging when collaborating with others? I think what's important is, like what we mentioned, regardless of how our activism looks like, we are very community centric, we're very community focused. A lot of us are trying to steer away from the capitalist hierarchical model, whether it's creating a nonprofit or even for a for-profit business. A lot of the younger folks are steering away from that. We want to really start from the ground up to be equitable. I'm also part of another, employee owned as well. That's another term for the community-centric kind of model. I'm working with, I'm an advisor to another CEO of a cybersecurity startup, and they are very intentional. One of the most specific examples is that they're very intentional with where they get their funding. Like I mentioned, there's a nonprofit industrial complex. That basically means that, when how nonprofits work is they get fundraising and they get funds from for-profit businesses that are not sustainable in every way or in many ways. And we are trying to steer away from that. We're trying to be more conscious of where our funds come from, and we're trying to be more equitable across the board. It doesn't just apply to paying everyone the same way or being transparent with policies of promotion. It's going beyond that and really thinking about what does it take to dismantle this whole system. And that's kind of like my experience and my view. And in that sense, my forecast of where the future is heading. And I strongly urge the social entrepreneurs here to take steps in reflecting and aligning yourselves, whether it be your business or your identities, with that movement. And now I'll pass it on to Jennifer, who will share her experiences and her thoughts.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jennifer. I'm currently a consultant with Collective Flow Consulting. And my experience with global initiatives is that I have lived in multiple countries where I've studied the power dynamic and the presence of bias and specifically racism in all systems and structures. Racism is not something that just exists around us. It's something baked into the systems that we live amongst. I've also, as an anti-racist and anti-bias educator, anti-ableist educator, I've created accessible and inclusive education programs internationally. Do the SDGs contribute to anti-racism work? I would say that the SDGs do not contribute to my anti-racism or DEI work. And the reason for that is I feel the SDGs are made to be palatable. And I think that when you're doing the deep work and anti-racism and anti-ableist and anti-bias education or any work, you can't be palatable, right? We need to be clear and bold and say what it is and dismantle systems. And I feel like when you try to find a balance of being kind and tiptoeing around what you're actually doing and saying, I feel like you don't actually make changes. So what do I do to create equity and belonging when collaborating with others? I would say, as a person who, works as a disability advocate and an activist, I would say creating access. Access looks different for everybody, and we cannot reach justice if we don't have accessibility and if we don't have equity. So just taking a critical lens to systems and structures, realizing how there are hierarchical structures deeply ingrained in all of our systems globally, whether I was living in the Dominican Republic or Haiti or Guatemala or Egypt or America, it is a global thing. And, we need to be taking a critical lens and be more clear about what we're doing and more bold in our language. And again, the SDGs, I feel like, are palatable and don't do that. I'm trying to just keep us on time.
Well, you have 2 more minutes. Would you like to answer any of the other questions?
Did I skip any? I'm trying to see.
Pretty good. I think the last one I'd be curious for you to answer. How do you create equity and belonging in your work?
Oh yeah, that's what I answered that in the last one. I was saying about accessibility. I would say is my main focus as a person who works as a disability activist and identifying as having multiple disabilities myself. I think that accessibility needs to be the main key and equity.
Great. Awesome. Well, thank you to all our panelists. That was really great. And I will say that's something that we also noticed we're not captioning this conversation, and there's definitely opportunity for us to be more accessible in this meeting. And generally when we host meetings, when I host meetings outside of this, we try to get accommodations prior. So there's definitely things that you can do in your own meetings to make sure that you're reaching everyone. And I think the other point, just to echo what Tiffany was saying, is something that I do in my own work as well, is that they brought in an outside organization and that they're doing the work themselves, but they're also bringing in outside help. And I think that that's really important. You know, Sini, Jennifer, people that do this work and really know how to talk the talk are the ones that we should be listening to, and the ones to really bring into your orgs to make sure that you're doing it the right way. So to transition, just because we are short on time and I want to make sure that we have time in our breakouts, I wanted to go and have us interrogate the SDGs. Todd Miller wrote this book about borders and said, you know, borders themselves in a world built on justice and equality don't need to exist, right? Like they shouldn't have to exist. And he said, so he's really talking about from it, you know, abolishing borders and looking at countries from an abolitionist perspective, that when you know, truly use an abolitionist approach, that you are going to be building a more humane world. So when an abolition approach, meaning that we don't have the systems that we have now, we rebuild or we build new systems. And then when you ask the right questions, then you get better solutions. So if you know, for example, if we're building a humane world, why do we need borders? That's an example of that. So if we're looking at the SDGs, you know, what we want to do is interrogate the questions that are the SDGs themselves, and see if we can come up with the root, you know, not necessarily the root cause, because we've talked a lot about what the root causes are, but just to dial in and have a conversation in smaller groups and community about ways that we, you know, different ways and different lenses to look through. So we're going to play this game called 5 Whys. It's pretty simple and straightforward. When you get in your breakouts, somebody hopefully from my group or Echoing Green will be there. And but we really want participants to run the session. So it's a way to collaborate. It's again, you know, from accessibility and a comfort and inclusion standpoint, you don't have to have your camera on, you don't have to speak, you can type in the chat, but we would love it and we encourage it. We want the more voices, the better. So what you do is you have a problem statement. So every group is going to get a different statement. And what we're trying to get after is where the SDGs fall short. So your problem statement becomes your first why. So these are the problem statements we have. So for example, SDG 10 says reduce inequalities and is not explicit regarding racism or colonialism. So you would turn that into a why and say, why are the SDGs not explicit, right? In regarding racism and colonialism. So this is the problem statement. For example, I like to use the example, you know, I always get sick after a big trip. And then you say, well, why do I get sick after a big trip? Okay, because I don't sleep enough and I eat garbage on the road. And then, you know, you basically turn every question into a statement, and then that becomes your next question. So you do that 5 times. And then the idea is that, I mean, you could probably do this indefinitely, but at least you're getting closer to a root cause and understanding that this is really the heart of the matter. And sometimes I think what Jennifer alluded to this, and Sini alluded to this, and I think Ben and Tiffany too, like, we have to talk about this stuff. You have to have that conversation and you have to be explicit. And so this exercise is also to talk about the things, you know, I always say, like, in this instance, say the quiet part loud, as long as it's not harmful to anyone else, say the quiet part loud. So I'm going to share a deck in the chat, and then we're going to get put in breakout rooms, and there's 5 different rooms, 5 different statements that will turn into questions. Before I do that, does anybody have questions? No? Good? Okay.
How long are we in the rooms for? I'm sorry, I do have a question.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you for saying that. So we're going to do 20 to 25 minutes, and we'll come on and give you a 5-minute warning. And before I before we go into breakout rooms, I want to share this deck. So I'm going to put it in the chat. So please open it if you have access to a browser, if you're not on your phone or whatever. And you don't have to use this format in your group. You can use paper and pen, doesn't really matter. But we made a deck so that everybody in the groups can go and work on their statement. So whatever statement you get, you can write right in the Google Slides. You can write all over the section that you're in. If they're labeled wrong, like whatever the label is, ignore if it says A, B group, C group, doesn't matter. Just follow your question, and I will make sure that the questions are clear for each group. Does that make sense? So there's 5 questions. There'll be 5 breakouts, and we'll make sure that each breakout gets a question.
Emily, we're running into an issue that we can't access with the deck. It's
Okay, I will make it so that everybody can. Thank you. Let's see here. 1 second. I think I have to switch it, so give me 1 second. In the meantime, if we can get through, yeah, Jennifer, go ahead.
I was going to say, can we copy and paste the questions into the chat is one idea. And then also, since the panelists will all be split into different rooms, we have access. So if we can bring the questions with us, from our phones or however we can access it.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, and actually, it was probably pretty helpful since we have access. If everybody that's in Echoing Green or in our group could just do the deck, that probably is easier for people to participate in conversations. That's a great idea, Jennifer. So I will make sure that they're numbered instead of lettered right now while we get put into groups. And I'll make sure that it says that in the chat also. Mariana, are you going to move us? Okay, good. Great.
And I'm sorry, Claudia, that you got cut off, but
Where were we?
No, I was concluding. That's the.
Yeah, I wanted to give everybody a little bit bigger of a warning than that, than a minute to go, because we had about 13 minutes, but that's okay. Did anybody actually get to the last one, to the root cause? Jennifer's group did, okay. Can't see everybody on the screen.
I would say that our 4th one are so deep between the 3rd and the 4th that the 5th was like missed.
Yeah, we were getting there too, I think, for sure. Well, it was a good conversation. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Fabulous. Well, I'm really appreciative that everybody participated. I think there was some confusion. I made a separate deck for everybody to work in. So I apologize if the numbers and everything got confused, but as long as we have some notes, I can't wait to see what everybody wrote. And I wish we had more time, because I would have loved to keep going on that as well. So we will share back out kind of, at least not necessarily the root cause, if you will, but some of the root causes and where everyone got in that information when we share out the poll results as well. Before I wrap up, is there anyone from anywhere in this room? It's a small room, so I'm just going to open it up, that wants to share or has a question about Catalyst 2030 or where we are headed with this work specifically?
That was my question. I was like, now that you'll have all this information from all of us, it was very clear we all want to be here. And we're like, okay, so those folks who don't want to be here, how are we what are next steps? How are we going to really affect change with those who we're going to have those hard conversations and need to have them? What do we do?
Yeah, that's a great question, Colleen. So I think, you know, from a Catalyst perspective, and again, I'm a member, I'm representing Catalyst, but I am, you know, it is a decentralized org, so all the members kind of work together. I think that there is a desire to start incorporating this anti-racism work into their work. I don't think that they really, you know, to be frank, have a perfect picture of what that looks like. And I think that my picture of what that looks like, I've been very frank with them that they should hire, you know, people to put in training at the top, and that training should trickle down into all of the orgs that we work with should have to either, not necessarily just a training, right? But that should have to have, we should be a leader in this spot, or not, right? Like if we're going to do this, we have to lead by example, that everybody's org actually has to have these things. And I think like Claudia worked with the US group, and it was interesting to me that you had a poll of like how many have worked with anti-racism in their org, right? And how many actually want to. And there was 10% that were like, we don't need to. And I'm like, okay, well, that's where we start for sure. Those 10% need to know that they need to do something. And if there's 10% in this org that doesn't think they need to do anything around decolonization and anti-racism, that's concerning. I think like what Ben said for me, and again, I want other people to weigh in, but for me, this is a huge existential problem for me to be part of an org that has goals, and the goals are virtue signaling, and the goals don't really hold weight, and then we're still doing the work. But being a part of this community is great. Like I've met Claudia, and I've met a lot of really people doing really amazing work. But I'm also like not 100%, as Sydney said it so well, like the full philanthropic industrial complex is really challenging. And within Catalyst 2030, you're either playing by those rules or you're not so far, and there's no in between. And that is something that I feel like is a problem. So I see Ben thumbs up, you know, so I think it's interesting because we're here as representatives. I think that there's a huge potential with this group. However, I think that they have a lot more to do. And for me, because this was formed in, you know, this org was formed in a way that wasn't necessarily from a decentralized lens, right? Or in any other way. I personally feel like if they don't put funds in at the top, if Catalyst doesn't invest in this at the top, and the leaders don't, like they're not even here in a lot of this room, then I don't see it actually taking off in that way. Like we know that anti-racism work has to be made from a financial standpoint. So that's my 2 cents. I would love to hear from you know, anyone else. Tiffany, I would love to hear your perspective also on that. And you know, Cindy.
Yeah, Yasmin has her hand up.
Yasmin, okay. Yes, sorry, I can't see everyone.
Yeah, so just to say, together with Mariana and Martina, we work at the Secretariat. So, you know, just shortly, just on efforts that have been taken at the Secretariat level to measure diversity among the network are progressing, but we've made it a point, you know, to bring up, okay, it's measuring diversity, but is it measuring it at different power structures? Is it just in the membership, or is it in the incubation board as well? Is it in, you know, the funding group? So I think emphasis on ensuring that diversity can be measured across the power structures.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I will say that one of the other bonuses of Catalyst is that there is Yasmin, Mariana, Julia, who's not in this room, who works on the gender group. There's a lot of younger members that are very bold in their way of shifting power. And that's one of the reasons I'm still part of this org, is because I really like how they're pushing back and even letting us push back, I mean, in this room. But, you know, I wish there were more people here present, like Holly said, you know, how do we get more people in the room? So that's something we're gonna be working on. Cindy, go for it.
Yeah, real quick, I know we are out, kind of like almost at time. Firstly, thank you, Claudia, Yasmin, Mariana. I think we had a very productive discussion, and I think what I want to leave everyone with is when we think about power structures, we need to be aware of who has the power, and doesn't mean that they should make the decisions. Who has the power has to listen to the ones whom we are trying to liberate, and not operate from a savior complex, but rather use our power to amplify their voices. And it can look like in the workplace where it's like, for example, me saying that, hey, I think Kali said something similar to quote somebody else, and not taking credit for other people's work, especially if they are Black, Indigenous, people of color. Something as simple as that is something that we have to do on a daily, not just and that's how we tackle systems. I think when we say dismantle systems or abolish systems, people get very I don't want to be political, I don't want to be controversial, and that's irresponsible. to put it simply, we all have a part to play. And the second thing I want to say is too that again, it's capitalistic societies make us think that we are all experts, and that makes us unreceptive to feedback. And so I applaud everyone here who both whether you're supportive of SDGs or this is like more of the first times you heard about SDGs, that you are open to that feedback about this system that you have been looking at as the organization that is Catalyst, and being able to be critical about it. I know that people it's human nature to be protective of what we stand for. And so the ability for you all to talk about it and look at different ways that we can improve it so that we can better benefit people, and also dismantle systems that have oppressed so many of us for so long. I applaud everyone, and thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you. I can't say that better, so I won't. I think next steps are we're going to gather all of what we talked about. We really encourage people to join the next conversation, and the next conversation is going to be about what do we want to actually do with this information, and whether that's because Catalyst has connections to the UN, like how are we gonna push back there? Are we gonna push, like implement in our own orgs? I think is something that we all agree is really important. And some of us are doing that. We want to see how we can help other people do that as well. But for me also, it's communicating back to Catalyst that they need to invest in this, because at the end of the day, and the last slide is, basically I will end here, which is that we won't actually reach the SDGs if we don't do this. So it's incumbent on them to invest in it. And the hard part is, we talked about in our group, what people are willing to do and to invest in is a challenge, right? But because for them to hand over power and wealth, does it serve them? Well, the thing is, it does serve them, because we will literally not make their goals that they set out. They will fail if they don't start centering and including racism, anti-racism work and decolonization work in their work, right? Like, they will not work. So all of the data, all of these studies people have done outside of the UN have said, you will not make it if you do not tackle these things. And so it's incumbent upon them to invest in it. And that's at least for me, that's what I hope to communicate back out of this work at this session into the bigger Catalyst, and then hopefully have that, show up in our work together. So that is where we are. Oh, wrap up, call to action. So I would say my call to action is please feel free to reach out to any of us. Also, I would encourage you all to connect with us, at least me and my, Sinyi and Jennifer on LinkedIn. We're pretty active on LinkedIn, and we talk about anti-racism and all of these subjects, I would say, pretty much daily. So, follow Sinyi and Jennifer, and there's a lot of other people that you can follow on LinkedIn that really are talking about this, just so you can kind of get it into your vernacular if you're not used to talking about it. Ben, you want to say anything? Tiffany from Echoing Green?
I mean, high level, just the thanks everyone for joining. Really appreciate all of your input. We'll follow up with Emily's points, but no, I think you said it well. Thanks everyone. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. And I really appreciate everybody participating and speaking up.
Yeah.
Have a great day.
Great. Thanks everyone.